Question 3. Why didn't millions of Native Americans stop a few thousand European conquerors? Our goals for this lesson. We want to learn about the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish. We'll try to understand the factors that made European conquest successful. To do that, we'll explore key people and events such as Cortez's conquest of the Aztec, Pizarro's conquest of the Inca, Spanish explorers who went into North America, and the founding of New France. We'll also consider the consequences of the conquest of the Americas on people on both sides of the Atlantic. Our big idea. Spain developed its American empire through military conquest and because Native Americans died in large numbers from Old World diseases. They focused on extracting precious metals. Alternatively, the French engaged in a beaver trade, which led them to develop scattered settlements and cultivate good relationships with Native Americans. Let's get started with our introduction. In his 1997 book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, historian Jared Diamond summarized his theory as to why Europeans were able to conquer so much of the world in the centuries between 1492 and 1900. His thesis became the 3 words of the title of his book, and his reasoning is sound. Europeans had metalworking technology. It is true that gunpowder was an invention of China, but the Europeans arrived on the battlefields of the Age of Discovery with weapons far superior to anything the defenders could muster. Importantly also, Europeans and Africans carried diseases to the New World that devastated Native American populations. As part of the exchange of ideas, food, animals, and microbes between the Old World and New, diseases that Native Americans had no immunity for swept across the hemisphere and wiped out 90% of the population. But despite these advantages, both understood and mysterious at the time, it defies logic that a few thousand Europeans could overthrow the powerful empires of Central and South America and subdue millions of people in just a few decades. How was this possible? Couldn't the Native Americans see the danger the Europeans posed? Why didn't millions of Native Americans stop a few thousand European conquerors?
Los Conquistadores. Columbus's discovery opened a floodgate of Spanish exploration. Inspired by tales of rivers of gold and timid, malleable natives, later Spanish explorers were relentless in their quest for land and gold. Known as conquistadors, or conquerors, they came by the thousands and established a thriving, albeit violent, and culturally destructive empire in America. The fall of the Aztec. Hernán Cortés hoped to gain hereditary privilege for his family, tribute payments and labor from natives, and an annual pension for his service to the crown. Cortés arrived on Hispaniola in 1504 and took part in the conquest of that island. Long before Cortés landed in Mexico at Veracruz on Good Friday, 1519, portents of doom appeared. A comet, bright as to turn night into day, lit the sky. Dismayed soothsayers and astrologers maintained they did not see it. For this unhelpful approach, Montezuma, the king of the Aztec Empire, cast them into cages where they starved to death. Then an important temple burned. Lastly, hunters brought Montezuma a bird with a mirror strapped to its head. In it he saw large numbers of people advance as for war. They appeared to be half men, half deer. How much of this is fact? How much is myth? By the time spies brought tales of mountains floating upon the sea, or Spanish galleons, and men with flesh very white, a long beard and hair to their ears, Montezuma's nerves were shattered. Was this the legendary feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, who, having vanished into the Eastern Ocean, now returned? Montezuma half convinced himself Cortés was a god. He sent Cortés the feathery costume of Quetzalcoatl with other gifts, including 20 ducks made of gold, very natural looking. Cortés took the bold move of marching on Tenochtitlan. With a force of 500 Spanish soldiers and whatever warriors he recruited along the way, he faced Montezuma on the city's southern causeway on November 8, 1519. Montezuma invited him in. Cortés and his men were astonished by the incredibly sophisticated causeways, gardens, and temples in the city, but they were horrified by the practice of human sacrifice that was part of the Aztec religion. Above all else, the Aztec wealth in gold fascinated the Spanish adventurers. Hoping to gain power over the city, Cortes took Montezuma, the Aztec ruler, hostage. The Spanish then murdered hundreds of high-ranking Aztecs during a festival to celebrate Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. This angered the people of Tenochtitlan, who rose up against the interlopers in their city. Cortes and his people fled for their lives, running down one of Tenochtitlan's causeways to safety on the shore. Smarting from their defeat at the hands of the Aztec, Cortes slowly created alliances with native peoples who resented Aztec rule. It took nearly a year for the Spanish and tens of thousands of native allies who joined them to defeat the Mexica in Tenochtitlan, which they did by laying siege to the city. Only by playing upon the disunity among the diverse groups in the Aztec Empire were the Spanish able to capture the grand city of Tenochtitlan. In August 1521, having successfully fomented civil war as well as fended off rival Spanish explorers, Cortes claimed Tenochtitlan for Spain and renamed it Mexico City. The traditional European narrative of exploration presents the victory of the Spanish over the Aztec as an example of the superiority of the Europeans over savage Indians. However, the reality is far more complex. When Cortes explored central Mexico, he encountered a region simmering with native conflict. Far from being unified and content under Aztec rule, many peoples in Mexico resented it and were ready to rebel. One group in particular, the Tlaxcalan, threw in their lot with the Spanish, providing as many as 200,000 fighters in the siege of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish also brought smallpox into the Valley of Mexico. The disease took a heavy toll on the people of Tenochtitlan, playing a much greater role in the city's demise than did Spanish force of arms. Cortes was also aided by a Nahua woman called Malitzin, also known as La Malinche, or Doña Marina, her Spanish name, whom the natives of Tabasco gave him as tribute. Malitzin translated for Cortes in his dealings with Montezuma, and whether willingly or under pressure, entered into a physical relationship with him. Their son, Martin, may have been the first mestizo, a person of mixed indigenous American and European descent. Malitzin remains a controversial figure in the history of the Atlantic world. Some people view her as a traitor because she helped Cortes conquer the Aztecs, while others see her as a victim of European expansion. In either case, she demonstrates one way in which native peoples responded to the arrival of the Spanish. Without her, Cortes would not have been able to communicate, and without the language bridge, he surely would have been less successful in destabilizing the Aztec Empire. By this and other means, native people helped shape the conquest of the Americas. Fall of the Inca. The Spanish explorer Francisco Pizarro first arrived in South America in 1526 and recognized the wealth and abundance that could be won by conquering the Inca Empire, which was then at its greatest power. He went back to Spain to ask for the official blessing of the Spanish crown to conquer the area and become governor. Upon his return, 2 years later, with the royal blessing, Pizarro and a small force of Spanish conquistadors set out to recreate Cortes's success against the Aztec. Many problems within the Inca Empire worked to their disadvantage. Foremost among these was that the Inca had turned against themselves in a civil war. The ruling Inca Empire, Huayna Capac, and his designated heir, Ninan Cuyuchic, died of disease. It was most likely smallpox, which had quickly traveled down to South America after the arrival of Spanish explorers in Central America. Brothers Huáscar and Atahualpa, two sons of the Emperor Huayna Capac, both wanted to rule after their father's death. Initially, Huáscar captured the throne in Cusco, claiming legitimacy. However, Atahualpa had a keen military mind and close relations with the military generals at the time, and proved to be the deadlier foe. By 1532, Atahualpa had overpowered his brother's forces via intrigue and merciless violence, scaring many local populations away from standing up to his power. This civil war left the population in a precarious position just as Pizarro and his small force were arriving. The Spanish forces went to meet with Atahualpa and demanded he convert to Catholicism and recognize the authority of Charles I of Spain. Because of the language barrier, the Inca rulers probably did not understand much of these demands, and the meeting turned violent, leaving thousands of native people dead. The Spanish captured Atahualpa and kept him hostage, demanding ransoms of silver and gold. They insisted that Atahualpa agree to be baptized. Although the Inca ruler was mostly cooperative in captivity and was finally baptized, the Spanish killed him on August 29, 1533, essentially ending the potential for larger Inca attacks on Spanish forces. Even though the Inca Civil War made it easier for the Spanish armies to gain control initially, many other contributing factors brought about the demise of Inca rule and the crumbling of local populations. As scholar Jared Diamond points out, the Inca Empire was already facing threats. Local unrest in the provinces after years of paying tribute to the Inca elite created immediate allies for the Spanish against the Inca rulers. Second, demanding terrain throughout the empire made it difficult to keep a handle on populations and goods as the empire expanded. Third, diseases that the population had never been exposed to, such as smallpox, diphtheria, typhus, measles, and influenza, devastated large swaths of the population. And finally, superior Spanish military gear, including armor, horses, and weapons, overpowered the siege warfare more common in the Inca Empire. The Spanish named their vast, newly won region the Viceroyalty of Peru and set up a Spanish system of rule, which effectively suppressed any type of uprising from local communities. The Spanish system destroyed many of the Inca traditions and ways of life in a matter of years. Their finely honed agricultural system, which utilized tiered fields in the mountains, was completely disbanded. The Spanish also enforced heavy manual labor taxes, called mita, on the local populations. This meant every family had to offer up one person to work in the highly dangerous gold and silver mines. If that family member died, which was common, the family had to replace the fallen laborer. The Spanish also enforced heavy taxes on agriculture, metals, and other fine goods. The population continued to suffer heavy losses due to disease as Spanish rule settled into place. The Spanish in North America. Spain's drive to enlarge its empire led other hopeful conquistadors to push further into the Americas, hoping to replicate the success of Cortés and Pizarro. Hernando de Soto had participated in Pizarro's conquest of the Inca, and from 1539 to 1542 he led expeditions to what is today the southeastern United States, looking for gold. He and his followers explored what is now Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas. Everywhere they traveled, they brought European diseases, which claimed thousands of native lives, as well as the lives of the explorers. In 1542, De Soto himself died during the expedition. The surviving Spaniards, numbering a little over 300, returned to Mexico City without finding the much-anticipated mountains of gold and silver. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was born to a noble family and went to Mexico, by then called New Spain, in 1535. He presided as governor over the province of Nueva Galicia, where he heard rumors of wealth to the north. Between 1540 and 1542, Coronado led a large expedition of Spaniards and native allies to the lands north of Mexico City, and for the next several years they explored the area that is now the southwestern United States. Rather than leading to the discovery of gold and silver, however, the expedition simply left Coronado bankrupt. Those who lost the conquest. Physical power to work the fields, build villages, process raw materials is necessary for maintaining a society. In the 1500s and 1600s, humans could derive power only from the wind, water, animals, or other humans. Everywhere in the Americas, a crushing demand for labor bedeviled Europeans because there were not enough colonists to perform the work necessary to keep the colonies going. Spain granted encomiendas, legal rights to native labor to conquistadors who could provide their service to the crown. This system reflected the Spanish view of colonization. The king rewarded successful conquistadors who expanded the empire. Some native peoples who had sided with the conquistadors, like the Tlaxcalan, also gained encomiendas. Malitzin, the Nahua woman who helped Cortés defeat the Aztec, was granted one. The Spanish believed native peoples would work for them by right of conquest, and in return, the Spanish would bring them Catholicism. In theory, the relationship consisted of reciprocal obligations, but in practice, the Spanish ruthlessly exploited it, seeing native people as little more than beasts of burden. Convinced of their right to the land and its peoples, they sought both to control native labor and to impose what they viewed as correct religious beliefs upon the land's inhabitants. Native peoples everywhere resisted both the labor obligations and the effort to change their ancient belief systems. Indeed, many retained their religion or incorporated only the parts of Catholicism that made sense to them. The system of encomiendas was accompanied by a great deal of violence. One Spaniard, Bartolomé de las Casas, denounced the brutality of Spanish rule. A Dominican friar, Las Casas had been one of the earliest Spanish settlers in the Spanish West Indies. In his early life in the Americas, he owned Native American slaves and was the recipient of an encomienda. However, after witnessing the savagery with which encomenderos, or recipients of encomiendas, treated the native people, he reversed his views. In 1515, Las Casas released his native slaves, gave up his encomienda, and began to advocate for humane treatment of native peoples. He lobbied for new legislation, eventually known as the New Laws, which would eliminate slavery and the encomienda system. Las Casas' writing about the Spaniards' horrific treatment of Native Americans helped inspire the so-called Black Legend, the idea that the Spanish were bloodthirsty conquerors with no regard for human life. Perhaps not surprisingly, those who held this view of the Spanish were Spain's imperial rivals. English writers and others seized on the idea of Spain's ruthlessness to support their own colonization projects. By demonizing the Spanish, they justified their own efforts as more humane. Almost all European colonizers, however, shared a disregard for Native Americans. Native Americans were not the only source of cheap labor in the Americas. By the middle of the 1500s, Africans formed an important element of the labor landscape, producing the cash crops of sugar and tobacco for European markets. Europeans viewed Africans as non-Christians, which they used as justification for enslavement. Denied control over their lives, slaves endured horrendous conditions. At every opportunity, they resisted enslavement, and their resistance was met with violence. Indeed, physical, mental, and sexual violence formed a key strategy among European slaveholders in their effort to assert mastery and impose their will. The Portuguese led the way in the evolving transport of slaves across the Atlantic. Slave factories on the west coast of Africa, like Elmina Castle in Ghana, served as holding pens for slaves brought from Africa's interior. In time, other European imperial powers would follow in the footsteps of the Portuguese by constructing similar outposts on the coast of West Africa. The Portuguese traded or sold slaves to Spanish, Dutch, and English colonists in the Americas, particularly in South America and the Caribbean, where sugar was a primary export. Over 10 million African slaves were eventually forcibly moved to the Americas, where they found themselves mining and working on plantations. Las Casas estimated that by 1550 there were 50,000 slaves on the island of Hispaniola. However, it is a mistake to assume that during the very early years of European exploration, all Africans came to America as slaves. Some were freemen who took part in expeditions, for example, serving as conquistadors alongside Cortés in his assault on Tenochtitlan. Nonetheless, African slavery was one of the most tragic outcomes in the emerging Atlantic world. If the story of the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish seems to be a long saga of failure and suffering on the part of Native Americans and Africans, that is because it is indeed a long saga of suffering. However, there is one story of resistance to Spanish rule that has come to be celebrated in modern times by those who champion indigenous rights, and that is the story of the Pueblo Revolt. Intent on expanding their empire, Spanish conquistadors looked north to the land of the Pueblo Indians in what is now the state of New Mexico. Under orders from King Philip II, Juan de Oñate violently explored the American Southwest for Spain in the late 1590s. The Spanish hoped that what we know as New Mexico would yield gold and silver, but the land produced little of value to them. In 1610, Spanish settlers established themselves at Santa Fe. As they had in other Spanish colonies, Franciscan missionaries labored to bring about a spiritual conquest by converting the Pueblo to Catholicism. At first, the Pueblo adopted the parts of Catholicism that dovetailed with their own long-standing view of the world. However, Spanish priests insisted natives discard their old ways entirely and angered the Pueblo by focusing on the young, drawing them away from their parents. This deep insult, combined with an extended period of drought and increased attacks by local Apache and Navajo in the 1670s, which the Pueblo came to believe were linked to the Spanish presence, moved the Pueblo to push the Spanish and their religion from the area. Pueblo leader Pope demanded a return to native ways so the hardships his people faced would end. To him and to thousands of others, it seemed obvious that when Jesus came, the Corn Mothers went away. In 1680, Pope led an uprising against Spanish rule, known now as the Pueblo Revolt, and tried to bring about a return to prosperity and a pure native way of life. Galleons, trade, and pirates. As Spain's New World Empire grew, Spanish merchants expanded their economic empire. By 1565, Columbus's original dream of connecting Europe and Asia by water was essentially complete. Twice each year, giant galleons departed Manila Harbor in the Spanish colony of the Philippines en route to Acapulco on the Pacific coast of Mexico. The galleon trade was supplied by merchants largely from Fujian province in southern China who traveled to Manila to sell Spaniards spices, porcelain, ivory, lacquerware, processed silk cloth, and other valuable commodities. Cargoes varied from one voyage to another, but often included goods from all over Asia, including jade, wax, gunpowder, and silk from China, amber, cotton, and rugs from India, spices from Indonesia and Malaysia, and a variety of goods from Japan, including fans, chests, screens, and porcelain. These goods were mostly brought in by silver mined from Mexico and Potosi in Bolivia. In addition, slaves from various origins were transported from Manila. The cargoes arrived in Acapulco and were transported by land across Mexico to the port of Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico, where they were loaded onto the Spanish treasure fleet bound for Spain. This vast array of wealth, packed tightly into a few ships which traveled on predictable schedules a few times each year to take advantage of the prevailing winds, was a ripe target for Dutch and English pirates, and the galleons were outfitted with a potent array of weaponry to protect them. The cat-and-mouse game between the Spanish ships and the pirates inspired stories and legends that fuel the imagination even today. They were the original and the real pirates of the Caribbean. Sometimes these great ships were lost in storms, and treasure hunters continued to scour the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea looking for lost Spanish gold. The Spanish Golden Age. The exploits of European explorers had a profound impact both in the Americas and back in Europe. An exchange of ideas, fueled and financed in part by New World commodities, began to connect European nations and in turn to touch the parts of the world that Europeans conquered. In Spain, gold and silver from the Americas helped to fuel a golden age, the Siglo de Oro, when Spanish art and literature flourished. Riches poured in from the colonies and new ideas poured in from other countries and new lands. The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled a collection of territories including Austria, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and Spain, encouraged and financed the work of painters, sculptors, musicians, architects, and writers, resulting in a blooming of Spanish Renaissance culture. One of this period's most famous works is the novel The Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha by Miguel de Cervantes. This two-volume book, 1605 and 1618, told a colorful tale of an hidalgo, or gentleman, who reads so many tales of chivalry and knighthood that he becomes unable to tell reality from fiction. With his faithful sidekick Sancho Panza, Don Quixote leaves reality behind and sets out to revive chivalry by doing battle with what he perceives as the enemies of Spain. Spain attracted innovative foreign painters such as El Greco, a Greek who had studied with Italian Renaissance masters like Titian and Michelangelo before moving to Toledo. Native Spaniards created equally enduring works. Las Meninas, or the Maids of Honor, painted by Diego Velázquez in 1656, is one of the best-known paintings in history. Velázquez painted himself into this imposing large royal portrait. He's shown holding his brush and easel on the left, and boldly placed the viewer where the king and queen would stand in the scene. New France. Competing with Spain, Portugal, and the United Provinces, or the Dutch Republic, and later Britain, France began to establish colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and India in the 1600s. The French first came to the New World as explorers, seeking a route to the Pacific Ocean and wealth. Major French exploration of North America began under the rule of Francis I of Spain. In 1524, Francis sent Italian-born Giovanni da Verrazzano to explore the region between Florida and Newfoundland for a route to the Pacific Ocean. Verrazzano gave the names Francesca and Nova Gallia to the land between New Spain and English Newfoundland, thus promoting French interests. In 1534, Francis sent Jacques Cartier on the first of 3 voyages to explore the coast of Newfoundland and the St. Lawrence River. Cartier founded New France by planting a cross on the shore of the Gaspé Peninsula. He is believed to have accompanied Verrazzano to Nova Scotia and Brazil, and was the first European to travel inland in North America, describing the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which he named the Country of Canadas, after Iroquois names, and claiming what is now Canada for France. He attempted to create the first permanent European settlement in North America at Quebec in 1541 with 400 settlers, but the settlement was abandoned the next year. A number of other failed attempts to establish French settlement in North America followed throughout the rest of the 16th century. Although, through alliances with various Native American tribes, the French were able to exert a loose control over much of the North American continent, areas of French settlement were generally limited to the St. Lawrence River Valley. Based more on cooperation than conquest, the French colonies profited from a growing trade in beaver fur. French coureurs des bois, or runners of the woods, traveled the interior of New France, trading European products for beaver pelts. The pelts were shipped back to Europe, where they were manufactured into hats. Because the fur trade relied on good relationships with Native Americans, there was relatively little interest in colonialism in France, which concentrated on dominance within Europe, and for most of its history, New France was far behind the British North American colonies in both population and economic development. In 1699, French territorial claims in North America expanded still further with the foundation of Louisiana in the basin of the Mississippi River. The extensive trading network throughout the region connected to Canada through the Great Lakes was maintained through a vast system of fortifications, many of them centered in the Illinois country and in present-day Arkansas. New France was the area colonized by France in North America during a period beginning with the exploration of the St. Lawrence River by Jacques Cartier in 1534 and ending with the cession of New France to Spain and Great Britain in 1763. At its peak in 1712, the territory of New France extended from Newfoundland to the Rocky Mountains and from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico, including all the Great Lakes of North America. In general, what distinguished New France from the other European settlements in the New World was that the French largely got along with the Native Americans and built very few cities. As trappers, most French colonists traveled, and the fur trade could only be profitable if Native Americans were willing participants. In the end, because they collaborated rather than replaced the Native Americans in their claimed territory, there were actually few French people at all in New France, compared to the density of Spanish and eventually English settlers in their American colonies. This would eventually prove to be a challenge for the French when it came to defending their empire. The West Indies. As the French Empire in North America grew, the French also began to build a smaller but more profitable empire in the West Indies. Settlement along the South American coast in what is today French Guiana began in 1624, and the colony was founded on St. Kitts in 1625. Colonies in Guadeloupe and Martinique were founded in 1635, and on St. Lucia in 1650. The food-producing plantations of these colonies were built and sustained through slavery, with the supply of slaves dependent on the African slave trade. Local resistance by the indigenous peoples resulted in the Carib expulsion of 1660. France's most important Caribbean colonial possession was established in 1664 when the colony of Saint Domingue, known today as Haiti, was founded on the western half of the Spanish island of Hispaniola. In the 18th century, Saint Domingue grew to be the richest sugar colony in the Caribbean. The eastern half of Hispaniola is today's Dominican Republic, which also came under French rule for a short period after being given to France by Spain in 1795. In the middle of the 18th century, a series of colonial conflicts began between France and Britain, which ultimately resulted in the destruction of most of the first French colonial empire and the near complete expulsion of France from the Americas.
Conclusion. The Spanish and French both built empires in the Americas, but their social and economic systems were vastly different. The Spanish replaced the native political leaders with their own royal governors and extracted the mineral wealth of the continent for the glorification of Spain. They brutally converted their new subjects to Christianity and used them as slaves. The French, on the other hand, did little to populate their new territories and collaborated with the Native Americans they met in order to trade. True, French missionaries also traveled the wilderness looking for converts, but the French colonial experience lacked the violent streak that marked Spanish America. Regardless of the differences, in the end, Europeans came to rule in the Americas, to the tremendous detriment of the native population. Which brings us back to our question. What do you think? Why didn't millions of Native Americans stop a few thousand European conquerors?